Legends are another part of the title of this class, and this week we're going to talk about what it means to be a legend. The term legend comes from the Latin, and it is usually used in a context of legendaries. A legendary is a book such as this one, The Golden Legend, which provides stuff to be read, which is the root of the word. A legend is something to be read. The first legendaries were written in the Middle Ages and collected stories about the saints, especially Catholic saints and Christian saints, generally speaking. And of course, they are meant for the people's enlightenment of what happened in the biblical times. By the Middle Ages, very few people were able to read for themselves, and they might not even understand Latin. So, having some kind of understanding of what was happening in the larger um, world of the church was a matter of education. And reading the Bible, reading scientific books, or whatever they might have been, was not necessarily something that most people could afford. But they might have heard of stories from the saints, and those stories could turn out to be quite exciting, in fact. So the legendaries were produced for the mass education of people to the stories that exist the in the church. Now, in the context of a legendary, you will find prayers alongside the stories, because, of course, the idea is not just to tell the story that exists, but also to uh, allow people to learn something from the story that they have read, and perhaps to be able to reproduce whatever the lesson of the legend is. So, in the context of the Middle Ages, you would have your daily prayers, your morning and evening prayers, and you would have your stories that are read alongside, your legends that are read alongside the prayers, so that you would learn the story's purpose, and you would learn about the saint and their traditional purview, or their traditional area of import. So obviously the title today, when we are using this idea of legend, is slightly different. But if you think more broadly of legends as traditional stories that have some sort of historical value, you will certainly understand much better what we are talking about today with the context of legend. And of course, it is probably useful to remember, because we have talked about myths in the past, that there is a difference between a legend and a myth, mostly in the fact that the myth typically covers a time that is very distant from ours, and it is sometimes going as far as the origin of the world itself, kind of containing a creation story of that sort. The legends don't have a beginning or an end in that way. They don't tell those large scale moments in our lives. They tell stories of specific people, and especially specific people who are experiencing a specific ordeal of some sort. And part of the legends that are available in these Middle Age legendaries would be the stories of crucifixion, for example, as is illustrated in this one. It could also be the stories of martyrdom, more generally speaking, people who were punished for believing in Christianity during that time. It could also be a little bit more mundane, such as the story of the circumcision of Jesus Christ, something that does not appear anywhere in the Bible, and most likely not something that most believers in Christianity typically think of on a day-to-day basis, but something that was a important lesson to be learned by the day-to-day people back in the Middle Ages. And certainly today, certainly crucifixion has lost some of its interest. Circumcision has lost some of its usefulness, because it is designed to avoid a specific kind of infection. But the practice itself keeps continuing, in part because of stories that explain or justify why people have to be circumcised, regardless of the actual medical advisory towards it. More generally speaking, because they are focusing on sense and because they are focusing on images and because they are telling stories that are not always particularly well asserted, the stories of the saints themselves were more or less popular depending on the kind of Christianity that people um, were following. And during the Reformation, especially the Christian Reformation in Europe, so um, essentially so after the Protestant the advent of Protestantism, that is when Christianity kind of split into two camps. The Reformation was the attempt from the mainstream church to regain some of its color and some of its meaning, when for the most part a lot of people would have thought um, of a kind of a meaningless doctrine dispute, kind of the theological dispute that most people don't care about. Um, so the Reformation made parts of Christianity a lot more accessible than it was before, and made the stories of the saints a little bit less meaningful, but they remained kind of as part of people's lore, really, folklore. People who would understand that, again, specific saints might be prayed to for the specific access to some realm of their life. So Saint Christopher for the voyagers, and etc. So the meaning of the story remained, even though the story might have disappeared to a certain extent. Now, an example of a saint that remained especially important is, for example, the saints that are attached to specific places. For example, Saint George, who is associated with the founding of the UK, the United Kingdom, and the story of Saint George is actually told, or the legend of Saint George is actually told in the Golden Legend, as from which the last couple of slides were posted. And this is the story. George, a native of Cappadocia, held the military rank of tribune. It happened that he once traveled to a city of Cylena in the province of Libya. Near this town there was a pond as large as a lake where a plague-bearing dragon lurked, and many times the dragon had put the populace to flight when they came out armed against him, for he used to come up to the city walls and poison everyone who came within reach of his breath. To appease the fury of this monster, the townspeople fed him 2 sheep every day, otherwise he would invade their city and a great many would perish. But in time they were running out of sheep and could not get any more, so having held a council, they paid him tribute of 1 sheep and 1 man or woman. The name of a youth or a maiden was drawn by the lot, and no one was exempt from the draft. But soon almost all the young people had been eaten up. Then one day the lot fell upon the only daughter of the king. So that gives you the essence of the story right here. That have the ritual. Why do we sacrifice these sheep to appease the dragon? And, whatever the dragon is. And once we run out of sheep, then we start sacrificing kids. And of course, once we start sacrificing all the regular kids, then it might turn out to be the return of an important dignitary kid. And of course, after that, the situation has to change because the people do not want to sacrifice the life of a noble young child. So the story in itself kind of tells you of kind of listening to the ritual and following the ritual, in this case, not necessarily knowing what it means, perhaps. So it is completely acceptable to sacrifice sheep because that's a small loss. It is completely accessible to sacrifice regular children because that's an acceptable loss, but it's not necessarily acceptable to sacrifice a princess. And so King Saint George, goes on to rescue the princess, and of course rescue the princess from the dragon. And the ritual has to stop. The dragon is slain, and the life is fundamentally different from people after that. So, in this context, of course, we can see quite easily how a legend is different from a myth because the truth of the matter of the myth is not so important. Whereas here, the truth of the story itself is a little bit more meaningful to everyone. Even though the setting itself, again, the dragon, whatever that is, and the fighting of the dragon and the kings of the princess and such, those things might be a little bit more of a detail in the story, but the story of following rules, the story of sacrificing children, all those things are told in a way that is designed to make people think about exactly why they do the things that they are doing. So there's a little bit of experience there, there's a little bit of an observation there, and certainly a little bit of a way to make people think about things, not necessary for them to wonder, but maybe to question how things work out. And legends in this context might be a little bit closer to a tale. And in fact, in our history, the word legend has been associated with Sagen in German, which is essentially a saying. So if you think of a legend as something you read and Sagen, tale, as something you say, you can see how those things could be pretty similar to one another. And a lot of our understanding about tales comes to us from the Brothers Grimm, who collected a lot of, well, stories, legends, tales from the German people in the late 18th, early 19th century. And this is an example from what Jacob Grimm was saying about legends. Every time a man journeys out into life, he is accompanied by a good angel who has been bestowed upon him in the name of his homeland and who accompanies him in the guise of an intimate companion. He who does not sense the good fortune that his companion brings him will nevertheless feel a sore loss the minute he crosses the border leading from his fatherland, where the angel will then forsake him. The benevolent companion is none other than an inexhaustible store of tales, legends, and history, all of which coexist and strive to bring us closer to the refreshing and invigorating spirit of the earlier ages. Now, of course, that's a lot here, but a lot of things that we have already told before. So we have a threshold that needs to be crossed. And once you get further out of your comfort zone, your tales and stories kind of disappear. You have the spirit that keeps the connection with you. And if you can tell the story, you are touched by the breath that comes out of the story. So the story serves as the spirit of your people. And of course, to more specifically speaking, here the person who is going away, kind of experiencing some kind of an ordeal or hardship, is connected to the place that they feel comfortable with through the legend. And here Grimm makes the very clear difference between those three different categories. Each of them has its own realm. The fairy tale is more poetic, the legend is more historical. The former exists securely, almost in and of itself, in its innate blossoming and consummation. The legend, by contrast, is characterized by a lesser variety of colors, yet it represents something special in that it adheres always to that which are conscious of and know well, such as the locale or a name that has been secured through history. Because of this local confinement, it follows that the legend cannot, like the fairy tale, find its home anywhere. Instead, the legend demands certain conditions without which it either cannot exist at all or can only exist in less perfect form. So, the strength of the legend is not only its connection, but its connection to a place. And you can make more sense of the connections with the people who you have some kind of connection with. For example, the previous story of St. George in Cappadocia, wherever that is, of course. If you understand what Cappadocia is, and if you have some kind of connection to St. George, then you can make sense out of what that story means to you. And here, the story of slaying a dragon in Libya is not necessarily something that we will get a whole lot from, of course, but the story has been able to change over the years to make sense of exactly how those things works. And like I said, after slaying the dragon in some parts of the story of the saints, St. George makes his way into Britain and ends up being the founder of modern Britain. At least so says the legend, of course. So making sense of these legends allows us to establish these connections between people and their places. And in this context, this is a very important way in which we can start to trace the movement of people around the world and movement of ideas around the world. If you can make a story of a quote unquote saint from quote unquote Cappadocia or the Middle East, and that person travels all the way to England to create a new country, then we have a pretty clear idea of the traveling force of Christianity, which has made its way all the way to the other side of the world and created people that are important for some reason. Another important thinker is Johann Bachofen, kind of one of those early anthropologists or ethnologists, if you want to call them that. This is a translation, so the date 1967 here is not accurate to the time he was writing. Bachofen is a 19th century writer, but he was writing in German, and his writing didn't really make it to us until the 20th century. But Bachofen, being well aware of the Grimms and of their influence on legends, was kind of deploring the fact that people were not so much interested in the legends, were more interested in the fairy tales. And again, the main reason why we know the Grimms are the fairy tales, not their legends. So far, our scholars have ignored this rich and well-documented tradition. They have concerned themselves solely with the eternal, hopeless task of investigating quote-unquote historical truth. As Grimm was pointing out, that legend is the stuff of history, taking no interest in a legend full of miraculous tales and impossibilities of all sorts, which forever excluded from the realm of history. Either they disparage it or they say nothing at all, but to deny the historicity of the legend does not divest it of its value. What cannot have happened was nonetheless thought. External truth is replaced by inner truth. Instead of facts, we find actions of the spirit. Banished from the realm of history, the Tanaquil tradition is a monument for the world of ideas. This ideal element suffices for our purposes. Not the historical events, but the ideas embodied in a tradition form the object of our comparative study. So of course, comparative studies are an important tool for anthropology, and I've always been, and this is why here Bachofen, like I said, is one of those early anthropologists, even though he had some all kinds of ideas that are no longer applicable to us. But by studying myth and studying legend, especially how those ideas were passed on from one place to the other, he was making sense of much larger traditions in European thinking that most people had not particularly thought of. Tanaquil here is a reference to the Etruscans, essentially the Romans before we talk about modern Rome, during that time of immediately before the antique I won't say legendary Rome, but you get it. So when you think of Rome, you think of Rome with Julius Caesar and all that. Etruscans are right before that time. So legends are part of our collective spirit, our collective memory, if you will. And even though they might not be 100% true or accurate to text, they have their value as a part of our history. And so our understanding of legend becomes a little bit more solidified through conversations in the 20th century when we realize that there is this odd mix between fact and fiction, between ideas and historical truth. So finding the meaning of a legend here is also a meaning of finding the connections as we are trying to trace them. So in Delay here, the legend, on the other hand, has of necessity some historical or topographical connection. It refers imaginary events to some real personage, or it localizes romantic story in some definite spot. Thus, one may speak of the legend of Alexander or Caesar, or of the legends of the castle of the Drachenfels in the Rhine, or that of the Red Lake, Lough Derg in Ireland. Such, in accordance with common usage, is the precise meaning of the terms we have to employ. So there is the possibility that you have an actual historical character that has a legend to it. And again, the truth of it is not so much important as the meaning of it. Legends do not necessarily mean that there's going to be a historical fact or some kind of an excuse for the history, and the history itself may be changed by the fact that the legend has been passed on for years and years. But the fact that it is somewhere between fact and fiction, somewhere between story and history, makes the idea of a legend a lot more useful to us.